Welcome to Rubber Bellissimo at the Movies, where we explore all things cinema. I want to welcome to the show Justin Owen Rawlins, who is an assistant professor of media studies and film studies at the University of Tulsa, and we're discussing his new book today, Reception, Identity, and American Screen Performance. It's called Imagining the Method. Justin, welcome. Thanks again for doing this.
Oh, thanks for having me on, Robert. It's a pleasure.
It's interesting to me that you coming from an academic background that you would have this much interest in screen acting because as you know, and I interviewed Isaac Butler as well. He was an actor, so I could see why he would start to write about the history of Stanislavski and the method and everything. But where does your interest in screen acting begin? Where did it start?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, Isaac and I have had this conversation as well, about kind of how we came to our subjects from very different backgrounds. I mean, for me, it was. I mean, I am a cultural historian in terms of my training, and I was working on a much smaller project years ago about John Wayne and about this movie that he did, this Howard Hughes film he did called The Conqueror, where he plays Genghis Khan. And it was a disaster in a whole bunch of ways. But one of the things that really struck me is that a fair amount of the reception of the film was something along the lines of Marlon Brando would have been better for this role. And I was like, okay, understanding that there's a long, very tragic history of white performers doing yellowface. Like, in addition to that, there's something else going on here in terms of the assumptions about who is better suited to play this role. And so that really started me thinking about, well, what kind of assumptions are happening here in terms of screen acting. Like what are people carrying into these movies that make them come out saying, oh, so and so would have been better for this, right? And so it really was that kind of academic exercise in trying to understand how we make sense of performance and how that not only includes the film-based performances, but how that also becomes indicative of a broader kind of a landscape of interpretation that's including the film role itself, but also the promotional rhetoric and the star image that the person brings in. I mean, you talked a lot about Brando on your podcast, and Brando is an excellent example of that, right? And how certain ideas of acting get percolate up to the surface and become ossified a bit in the kind of popular understanding of something, even when the actor themselves says, no, that's not what I do.
Right.
That's not who I am. Like Brando being an excellent example of that, to the day he died was like, I'm not a method actor. I studied with Stella Adler, right? Not Lee Strasberg. But I was very curious in how these ideas of acting really, in some cases, end up superseding the actual techniques, the approaches in popular culture. And so that's really where that project came from.
Did you ever have any acting experience yourself?
School plays, yes. Yeah. But I'm not. I would not consider myself a performer. But one of the things I think that interests me as well is that I've one of the areas I teach in is cultural anthropology, which is all about how human beings understand each other. And I think that from that perspective, one of the things I find most interesting about actors and acting is that so much of that work is about, not only understanding your own body as an instrument and all that stuff, but understanding human motivations, understanding, the kind of external and internal constraints and conflicts. And I think that is, from a kind of anthropological perspective, is so fascinating to think about, this form of labor that's really wrapped up in fundamentally understanding like how humans work and how they interact with each other.
Well, I'm so glad that you wrote this because as an actor myself, I've been I've been having these conversations with actors and directors for years
Yeah.
about method acting because everyone thinks it's this approach where if you're like De Niro, if you're playing a cab driver, you become a
Right.
driver and you're walking around on set in character all day, and it gets and I would always tell people, no, that's not. Because I never studied method acting. I studied Meisner technique, but I'd read, I've had a little method training, but I've read a lot of, Strasberg's books and Stanislavski's books. And I always would, even actors, think that that's what it is. And I always wondered, where did this,
Yeah.
why do people constantly think this in the press and everything? And,
Yeah.
and so you talk about, extensively, how people have taken to learn about this in a way
Yeah.
which is misguided. This whole approach, I would imagine, starts with De Niro, where you were hearing about him, like I said, becoming a cab driver to prepare for
Mhm.
Taxi Driver, gaining 60 pounds for Raging Bull, plus
Right.
learning how to fight. And because he was taught by Stella Adler, which I know is not method acting, but is associated with that approach.
It's kind of lumped into, lumped into like
Yeah,
method. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. It's and so that influenced so many actors to take those kind of
Yeah.
approaches as well. I mean, do you think that's sort of the root, more so, of why the likes of Daniel Day-Lewis and Jared Leto do what they do? Even because as you said, they say they're not method actors, but yet they do all this preparation that's
Right.
like extensive and insane a lot of the times. That's and I can't help but wonder, well, maybe this really just comes from De Niro, because really no one before him took these kind of
Yeah.
lengths.
Well, and Adler, one of the key points of differentiation for Adler's technique is like, doing extremely thorough research on a character, right? Like
Yeah.
you externalize it, whereas Strasberg was all about internalizing everything, which was part of their fundamental rift between Adler and Strasberg, and I think that one of the things I talk about in the book is that I think De Niro, his turn in Taxi Driver, Raging Bull, I think that those represent a kind of extreme externalization of what he learned with Adler, where it's like it's wasn't just enough to research what it's like to be a boxer. He had to become a boxer. He had to, gain the weight, then lose the weight, and so on and so forth. He had to become a taxi driver, right? Like, so, and I think that, part of the kind of reception of De Niro's turns, which are masterful turns, right? Those performances are incredible.
Yeah.
I could see how the performances themselves, as well as the kind of reception of those performances as like, something that is extraordinary, could become part of the larger firmament in which we understand, like, extraordinary acting, where it's like, okay, you have to do this, you have to mimic this,
Right.
this really a kind of idiosyncratic approach, right? Which is not part of any formal acting teaching, and then it just takes on a life of its own, and it gets to the point where we've got like, Jared Leto, or Christian Bale starving themselves, which
Right.
is extremely dangerous, right?
Yeah.
It's not, the human body is not supposed to lose 50, 60 pounds,
Right.
right? And and that is one thing. At the same time, we also hear stories about actors behaving badly on set and saying, well, that's me being in character, right? And so I think that in terms of like the extraordinary body transformation element, that's certainly, we can certainly see that with someone like De Niro. I think that one of the things I find really curious about the idea of method acting is that I think it's tapping into a lot of pre-existing ideas before Stanislavski and the Moscow Art Theater, tour, before like Slavic dramatic realism really takes hold in the 19 teens and 20s. I think there are pre-existing ideas within the US about like what it means to act and whose kind of style of performance is more valued, or you know, the way of understanding actors as being kind of pushing back against like commercial interests or being rebels, things like that. I think there are like these, you can see these little, ideological tributaries that kind of, eventually converge and feed into, and help to magnify the appeal of something like method acting, or at least the perception of method acting. So like when the group theater forms in the early 1930s, they don't just form out of nothing, right? Like they form because they're bringing a lot of these ideas, and they're kind of wedding these ideas to a way of acting. When the actor studio forms, something similar is happening, and then you add to that something like, De Niro transforming his body in really dramatic ways. And I think it lends itself well to the idea of like the idiosyncratic genius, right? And we can kind of see an external manifestation of their work, but we also know that it's so much of it is up here and thus inaccessible to us, right? That's part of their genius,
Right.
Is that they're able to do these things internally that we could not or would not do, and that I think that leads to us praising people like De Niro, but it also, one of the things I talk about toward the end of the book is that I think it also becomes this binary over the last 40 odd years, where in some cases we revere it, like
Right.
with De Niro stuff, but in other cases it almost becomes a bit of a cartoonish thing, like with say Jared Leto, right, where we make jokes about him, staying in character when he's making House of Gucci, or staying in character when he's making Morbius, right? And it's like I think those, revering Daniel Day-Lewis and kind of making fun of Jared Leto are two sides of the same coin.
Yeah. Something that you just mentioned, which also has always fascinated me, was that, you're right. You heard about these actors who came from this training who then were difficult to work with and would argue with directors. Hitchcock told that story about Montgomery Clift. I'm sure you know it, and I telling him, and I confess, when he comes out of a building to look up, and he, well, why do I have to look up? What's the motivation behind it and stuff like that? And so you hear these stories of, and of course, as you write extensively about, they basically satirized it in Tootsie, which a movie I also love.
Love that
where
movie. Yeah.
it's brilliant. And Dustin Hoffman's basically, because he was, as you of course wrote about, was known to be difficult and argue with directors, and so you see that in the film. He's getting, he's walking out on plays he's being cast in because he doesn't like the direction and things like that. So again, people associate that with method acting, but I mean, I wasn't in these classrooms, obviously. I doubt that teachers were saying, just argue with the directors,
Right.
So and I obviously I know much more about Meisner, and I can't say for sure, but I would highly unlikely he would tell actors to do such a thing. So again, is this just a series of coincidences that actors started to do that who came from this training? And now people think, oh, well, that's the method style. I mean, I don't know if how that kind of, where that connection comes from.
That's a great question. This is something I wondered too. Because, in terms of thinking, approaching this as a historian and going over the archives, we have so little. We have lots of documentation, lots of paper trails for conversations about, well, how do we publicize this movie, right? Or how do we publicize this performer? When James Dean came along, it was all about, well, let's literally, Warner Brothers, let's advertise him as the next Marlon Brando, right? And so that's just that rhetoric over and over again behind the scenes. But what we don't have so much of is a paper trail about the production, right? So in some cases we get lucky, and we have something like the making of Tootsie, right? We have that documented. We can see Hoffman saying things about all right, well, I just believe I believe that a movie is better when everyone's fighting, And you can just see how worn down Sidney Pollack is by all of this. It's like Sidney Pollack, who's trained, in the Meisner technique, right?
Yes.
He is of this larger, genealogy of dramatic realism, and you can just see he's like, no, that's not. I'm an experienced filmmaker. That just doesn't, compute for me. But that's nonetheless kind of how it ended up playing out, right? And I mean, it was exhausting just to watch that. I can't imagine having to like endure that as a member of that production. I think it might be similar to the weight gain thing, where there's a certain assumption made that the stories that come out about people being difficult on set are somehow necessary to the kinds of performances that we perceive, right? And so people hear about Brando in constant clashes with directors or studios, and there's an assumption made that it demonstrates an extraordinary devotion to his craft. The reality is that Brando just did not like the apparatus of Hollywood. He enjoyed, I think he enjoyed the kind of exercise of acting, and he enjoyed like interacting with people, but he didn't like the industrial side of it, right?
Right.
But there was a misunderstanding, promoted often by the industry itself, that was part of what made him a genius, right? And so I think, for the likes of Brando or Clift or Dean, that becomes part of their kind of star image, and thus part of a broader understanding that, well, that must be important to the creative process, to be so devoted that you don't collaborate, right? And as you're an actor, you know how the industry works. Collaboration is everything. Hollywood is fundamentally a creative, collaborative industry, and so you can't have someone going it alone. That just doesn't work.
Right.
And yet, I think the popular understanding of method acting, again, whether we're revering it or we're mocking it, tends to conflate maybe a certain performer's personality traits with the broader practice of the craft, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and everything that I'm gathering, it seems that most of these beliefs people have from method acting are stories from the press and the way in which they were promoted. You look at, and one thing I did, I mean, I knew that you write about John Garfield, and I knew that, people today largely say, oh, he was the first method actor who became a star. But at the time, not until, as you said, till the 70s was that actually the 20 or so years after he died were people actually saying that. And so, as you showed, he was actually promoted as like the rebellious tough guy.
But not a method actor. In part because he was the studio saw him as a pain in the butt, because he was like, I don't like playing street toughs every time. I don't like the way that you treat the actors. And the studios were like, well, I mean, then we'll just suspend you, right? But then that, of course, feeds into the idea, he's a rebel and all of that stuff too, right? But he was, one of those, like the circumstances around him were such that, if Garfield was emerging in the 1950s, like Brando or Dean or Clift, I think he would have been received in the same way that they were.
Yeah.
But he was coming out in the 30s and 40s, and so the landscape of Hollywood is very different and not nearly as receptive to a kind of outspoken kind of labor rallying Jewish kid from the East Coast. So basically there's a line in there, and I'm not the first to cite it, but there's a line in there from Jack Warner when he meets with John Garfield, and he's just like basically like tells him like don't be so Jewish, right?
Oh God, yeah.
And Garfield was, if anything, unapologetic about who he was and where he was from,
right?
And I think you see, whereas for someone like Brando, that was largely embraced, at least in the first decade or so of his film career. For Garfield, that was often held against him by the industry.
Yeah. It for people watching, because we've largely been talking about these misperceptions of this approach to acting. So, I mean, it's impossible to summarize this approach, but could you just talk a little bit about what you think method acting actually is from your perspective?
Sure. Well, I think that method acting, and yeah, I know people are going to disagree with this because this is part of the history of method acting, is that it's fraught with disagreement. My sense of it is that it's an approach to, it's part of a larger idea about performance as that's fundamentally rooted. Like I referred to like Slavic dramatic realism, the idea of like it being really important to act with some understanding of like the psychological state of your character, or kind of a dedication to a kind of a true realistic psychological portrayal of your character. But the difference is, how do you get to that point?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So for method acting, if we think about method acting as the kind of approach that was coined, popularized, practiced by like Lee Strasberg and kind of his adherents, that approach to psychological realism and truth is something that is almost entirely internalized, right? Like you are seeking your own kind of biographical experience and looking for points of commonality. You're looking for affective memories that you can tap into. So that I mean, that's in a very, very broad sense. That's kind of the way that I have thought about method, which is different than Adler, which was much more external. Like, you do research on this to try to find, like, to create that character and find.
Yeah.
It's not internal. And she was very, very adamant that, like, if you're asking people or forcing people to like look internally for that kind of stuff, that can lead to all kinds of exploitation, that you're not equipped as a teacher or even as a student to grapple with what comes out.
Right.
Which is all, and this is all very different than, again, from like Meisner, right?
Yeah.
Even though they're all, Meisner and Adler and Strasberg and Harold Kloorman and Morris Karnofsky and all these, Phoebe Brand, all these people who became really important acting teachers and writers, all came out of the group theater, right? So one of my favorite parts in the book was writing about this group of largely 20-somethings who end up redefining everything we know about acting in the U.S. And Canada, for like, the majority of the 20th century. It's a group of 20-year-olds hanging out in like, upstate New York and Connecticut,
Yeah.
and having these passionate debates about what it means to act.
Right.
And to me, I'm doing this research as someone who, at that time would have been considered like, elderly to these young people, right? Like, just
right.
imagining that, like, these are these formative ideas and these debates about how do we get to that place of truth and realism, and what kind of spins out of that, which is, so formative, but also tragic in its own ways. And some of these people became, sworn enemies and all of this stuff. But like, you see this kind of moment, and it's glorious. And you can kind of see seeds of those enormous arguments and fissures there. They're just not, they haven't materialized in the way that we, we'll come to know them later.
Mm-hmm. Well, another thing that's always fascinated me is there is this I'm talking generally speaking, but I know a lot of people believe that the classic Hollywood period, that the performances were more theatrical than that before the likes of Brando and Clift and Geraldine Page and these great actors came around, who came from method, and I know even Scorsese said, "Oh, I look at movies in terms of acting as before Brando and after Brando," and to me, I've never I've never quite understood why people think that anything before the 50s was like not truthful acting. I mean,
Right.
I mean, sure, there were over the top theatrical performances, but there always has been. I mean, even now we're seeing, people like Nick Cage is well known for doing these really big performances. And you even write, which I didn't know, you write about the fact that even within the Hollywood studio system, they had teachers. I knew that they had schools and teachers, but I didn't. Some of them actually came from the Stanislavski style because, as you wrote, from starting in the 20s, we had the people from the Moscow Art Theater in Russia coming and teaching, and so that was finding its way into the Hollywood studio system. And so, when I watch, because I love that era, as well, and when I watch Jimmy Stewart or Joan Crawford or Betty Davis and Joel McRae, these people are honest performers. I mean, sure, they may have their over the top moments, but they're incredibly truthful and realistic, and we don't even necessarily know how they were taught. I mean, a lot of the times it's like on the job kind of training and stuff like that. So I'm curious if you have any opinions as to, why people kind of think this way about that quote unquote pre-Brando period.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I've thought about this a fair bit, and I don't know that I have a definitive answer, but my sense of it is that a lot of it is tied up in kind of our received understanding of acting that we have at some point, and I think a lot of this is actually born out of anti-silent film bias and anti kind of histrionic acting bias. So I think a lot of this is actually born out of a bias that emerges in the 1940s and 50s with the popularization of more like kind of psychological realist, acting, that we can see a kind of more general diminishment of silent film just overall, like storytelling, special effects, acting, writing, and so on and so forth, directing. Now I think we have a healthier, more nuanced understanding of all the amazing things that the silent era gave us. But I think that the understanding of acting is one of the things that has been slowest to course correct. And I think that there's a misunderstanding of acting in the silent era that holds kind of the nuance of like method acting or the kind of Slavic dramatic realism, holds that up as like the norm. And so if something is more like histrionic or more showy, then it just gets kind of dismissed as like lesser, right? And we end up kind of falling into this binary where we think of, the pre-method period as one of like lacking truth or lacking realism. So I think I think it's largely just a misperception, but I think it's a misperception rooted in a misperception about distinctions between the silent and synchronized sound eras. And I think that's a distinction that we can see the studios themselves play up as a means of promoting, like new actor,
right,
and things like that. And you kind of you play it up by kind of just throwing shade on your own history, right, and your own kind of stable of performers. But yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, there is a lengthy history of dramatic realist understandings of performance being taught in acting schools. Like Sophie Rosenstein is teaching this stuff to stars, future stars, B actors, right? So it's I think it's a matter largely of perception, but a perception that the industry itself is responsible for perpetrating to suit its own kind of promotional goals in the moment. Like you've never seen someone like James Dean before. You've never seen someone like Clift before. It's a whole it's a level of rage and and nuance and tenderness and all this stuff. And it's like, well, you could look at any number of actors and see,
Yeah.
in the 1920s and 30s and see, not the exact same thing, but you can see like threads of that,
Yeah.
right? It's much the history of performances. There's so many approaches to acting that are being taught
Right.
in the industry. We would be I think it impoverishes our understanding of acting if we see something like Hollywood as, even at its most kind of industrial and commercial and monolithic, if we see the acting as somehow uniform. You know what I mean?
Mm. Yeah, for sure. I've my own take on it. Just if we're looking at someone like Brando, for example. The one big difference with him, you look at something like Streetcar Named Desire, was just the way in which he could tap into rage,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
even anguish. Was I mean, there are certainly great performances with men getting angry before that, but it was
Yeah.
so raw and explosive that
Yeah.
it may, quote unquote, look better, or more realistic. But I think perhaps the biggest thing may be that actors were starting to learn more about how to use themselves better and how to go
Yeah.
deeper,
Yeah.
and things like that. And also, as you know, of course, these actors from the method approach, or the Stanislavski variation of the Stanislavski approach, were rebelling against, being typed as, okay, now you're like, Cary Grant had a type, John Wayne
Yeah.
had a type, and they were like, no, we want to play diverse roles, we're actors, and
Yeah.
so, that started, done away with. But Cary Grant is still, an incredible actor, and in my book, an honest actor,
Yeah.
and so I think that is maybe when we started to see that, like, oh wow, look at how sort of deep they can go. I think that may have been something that was new, different. I don't know how you'd feel about that.
Oh, I agree. It's absolutely different, and I think it's part of it is Brando. Part of it is the approach to acting, right? His work primarily with Stella Adler. Part of it is the historical moment. Part of it are like the kind of, I think, the shifting working conditions in Hollywood, right? For an actor, like, the Brando comes along at a moment where actors suddenly start having a lot more freedom to choose their projects, to reject work without such severe consequences, right? And so I think it's this kind of perfect storm of, of an approach to acting, a personality in Brando, a kind of moment where, ideas about kind of repressed anger, right? These kind of pop Freudian ideas about like repressed anger are starting to become very, very widely disseminated and widely intriguing to people. Also, having an amazing writer like Tennessee Williams, right? Who's, something like Streetcar, which is all about that kind of that, Kowalski's struggle to repress his own rage, right? His own kind of masculine intensity. And it's like it's such a perfect meeting of like character and actor and writer and context and things like that. um that's I think it would absolutely be wrong of us to dismiss what Brando and his ilk were doing as actually something different. I
Yeah.
also think it's important that like the context in which they're doing it means it's received in a particular way, or makes it more palatable to a moment or more desirable to a moment. um yeah, it's I mean it's that's this is one of the challenges I think of working on like a reception of acting, because acting itself is so kind of elusive,
Mm,
right?
mm.
It kind of, by its very nature, it defies a kind of like documentation. There's the performance, but that's how do you how do you document that beyond like recording it, right?
Right.
So yeah, but I think, I to like watch Brando or to read Brando talking about, what it's like to act, or kind of to read, as you're very familiar with all of the, the biographical material we have about Brando, and kind of his own struggles with his, being in a family of actors, but like having such kind of struggles with like repression of anger and, mental health and all these things. Like you can see how that comes up to the surface in his work, right? And his like simultaneous fascination with people, but reluctance to be kind of promoted as a personality or a star. But then we think about like the studio is like, well, this is great. This is like, he's a sexy, angry man, and we'll promote him that way, right?
Right. Yeah.
And so much of that was used to promote him, and then he'd push back and he'd be like, yes, he's a bad boy. He's a bad boy. It's like, well, he's also someone who's, I think, struggling quite a bit and not handling stardom,
Right.
especially like gracefully. And, to the day he died, he was, really pushed back against these kind of characterizations. And when he dies, we're kind of right back to the same old script about Brando, the bad boy, and
Yeah.
Brando,
Yeah.
and all that stuff. It's this reception and kind of popular culture just, really can take on a life of its own that just kind of rewrites the narrative about, who an actor is or what acting can even mean.
You also talk about how this is, it's been very male dominated as well. I mean, the the people who are like brilliant and who are allowed to argue with directors, it's okay because they're from this approach, and they're all, white men, but there also were amazing women from the system who not only, taught, like Stella Adler and Uta Hagen, but
Yep.
you have people like Estelle Parsons and Anne Bancroft and many of them, and so, but yet we Joanne Woodward, but it doesn't seem as if people sort of put them on that same
Yeah.
pedestal. You might say that, or even in the classic Hollywood period, someone, I mean, talk about just like this who was capable of ferocious anger. I mean, Barbara Stanwyck, you see her in something like Babyface, and it's jaw dropping. And I don't know how she learned how to act, but it reminds you of that sort of raw, visceral approach. It seems as if the only actor who they sort of tried to say was like Brando, and the depth she could tap into. So they called her the female Brando. I don't know why. I love her,
Stanley.
but she was brilliant. But of course, it's like, oh well, she's like Brando, instead of just saying like, no, she's also the product of rage and despair, but yet we don't. Why is it that women don't get also that kind of?
She's a good actor, right? But she's also a difficult woman, right?
Right.
And the constraints put on difficult women are different than the constraints.
Of course, yeah.
I think it's, I think this is, again, I think this speaks to like the kind of the importance of the broader contextual factors, in terms of when people are performing. It's like there's the work, right? And then there's like the kind of reception of the work. And it's like you see someone like Kim Stanley or Stella Parsons, or, later someone like Barbara Loden. Yeah, you see these amazing actors doing incredible work, and you see like okay, I'm seeing all the same kind of characteristics that I would see like their male counterparts get celebrated for, and all this stuff, and then you're like looking around at the reception, you're like, I'm just not seeing the same kind of reaction to it, right? One of the things I wanted to talk about at the very end of the book was kind of the more recent trend of women performers kind of taking a page out of the De Niro stuff and like doing like the extreme body transformation.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, well, you can't deny that, right? So how does the reception manifest? And in so much of the reception, whereas the De Niro stuff was like, or the Bale stuff, it's like, what commitment, what extraordinary commitment to the preparation. And so much of the stuff around like Charlize Theron or Aniston or Nicole Kidman is like, well, when are you going to get pretty again? Right? Or like,
Yeah.
weren't you depressed, like putting on weight, right? That kind
Oh
of stuff.
God, yeah.
It's like it's it's maddening to see those things juxtaposed, right? It's also a reminder of a kind of long-standing trend in like the way that our kind of understanding of acting is also tied up in our the different expectations we carry for like the work that men do and the work that women do, right? And I mean, as a student of the classical Hollywood era, you know very well that like so much of that is also tied up in like the way that like men stars were promoted and women stars were promoted.
Yeah,
Like men stars like, do things, they're active. Women stars are like, well, they're kind of made, they're kind of produced, right?
Right.
There's a kind of inauthenticity attached to women stars oftentimes, which also kind of undermines the valuation of the work that they do, the extraordinary work. Barbara Stanwyck is such a great example. I mean, like,
yeah. Oh yeah, she's amazing.
So much contained rage, and you can see it. You can see it like in her character. You can see it like how she's performing in a way that you're like, this woman's about ready to explode, right?
Right.
And sometimes she does, and sometimes she doesn't. But like that's really difficult. It's really difficult to do. Like,
oh, for sure, yeah.
Average performer can't do that, and yet the kind of strictures of the time are not going to prize that work in a way that you might see for someone like Brando or Dean. It's to me it's like I tried to approach this project, and this is actually one of the reasons why I don't call it method acting so much. Like the thing I'm analyzing in the book, I call it methodness.
Yes,
yes. I feel like method has such a kind of freighted, loaded meaning that I didn't want to confuse or create confusion around like, the actual techniques and approaches that are really method acting, and then, the way that we kind of misperceive it and kind of in the way that is taken off, right? So it's like I wanted to try to not get caught up in or risk confusing people about like analyzing the misperceptions, which is something over here, and try to leave the work alone, because I think the work stands for itself. It's
absolutely
that I find so kind of contradictory, fascinating, but also tragic. I mean, it's, this is like people put their, this is art. People put their heart and souls and their
for sure
into this, and you see how it kind of, how very quickly one loses control over what their work means.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It also what stands out to me is that everything we're discussing is then utilized best within dramas, whereas why don't we talk about the great people who did great comedies who come from this school, because you can still certainly apply everything with truthful acting to comedy, but yet everything has to be so heavy. And as you know, of course, comedic performances are rarely nominated for Academy Awards.
Horror performances, genre bias is such a real thing. Genre bias is so real. I wish I had talked more about this, because I desperately wanted to write about Gene Wilder. Gene Wilder was a method actor.
Yes,
right?
Yes.
But like, are you going to see that in promotional discourse around Young Frankenstein or Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory? No, you're not, right? Like,
because it gets labeled as too heavy or too dramatic, quote unquote.
Right, and the kind of diminishing of comedic acting is somehow less labor intensive or less, just less serious. I totally agree. Like genre bias is absolutely a factor in that kind of privileging of serious serious work, and sometimes we see examples, exceptions kind of make their way through in horror or occasionally comedy, though not really, or occasionally melodrama, but really is like the drama is so so overrepresented in
Yeah.
terms of the total kind of creative output of performers. Well, just the kind of the valuations that come across through the like awards season.
Yeah, it's a shame because myself, all the great actors we're talking about are the ones that had strong influence on me and the kind of performances I was interested in taking on. But I've actually come to appreciate more of. I mean, if you had asked me who's your favorite actor from the classic period, I would have always said Brando, and he probably still is up there. But now I'm saying like, oh, it's actually Jack Lemmon, who
Yeah.
also comes from the Uta Hagen, studied with her, and which is from Stanislavski, and I mean, yeah, he's got a couple of Oscars, but they were always drama, I mean, and so we look at him as a great actor, and from the dramas, and well, he's also funny, but you're
Yeah.
you look at something like The Apartment or something like it hot, those are hard, those are not easy, those are challenging roles, but they're just very, very, very funny. It's too bad, that we just this sort of undervaluing of comedy and other things
It
like you mentioned.
it totally is because I mean, had if we placed more appropriate value on directing, writing, acting, you know, um, emerging out of all of the genres of films produced, I think it would make for more interesting conversations
For
about
sure, yeah.
that the creative choices that go into the process instead of
Yes.
kind of often stale rhetoric about suffering or something like that. And like that's certainly that 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 part of the human experience is certainly part of the overall repertoire of kind of things that we tap into as humans, and then as performers, as our kind of avatars. But that's not it. But that's not the entirety of it.
Exactly, yeah.
And this is I don't want to paint with a broad brush. Like this is I tend to talk about Hollywood, and so that is most definitely a Hollywood specific thing. I think it would also broadening up those conversations also would incidentally broaden our kind of our understanding and appreciation for genres that are maybe more prominent in other parts of the world, right? And other performance styles. Like
Yeah.
I think there's a broader thing that we unlock when we kind of get out of this like kind of drama fixation when it comes to like what we kind of industrially value the most in North America. That I think it unlocks broader, more interesting conversations and just more kind of openness to thinking about all of the really fascinating ways that we have as humans come to like imagine or make performances for the stage or the screen, right?
Hmm.
I think it unlocks so much, but we're kind of stuck in a bit of a rut in terms
Yeah.
of it's
Yeah.
got to be some kind of period piece where someone suffers, someone gains weight or loses weight, or this we're representing such a small small portion of like
Yeah. Yeah.
all of the creative output and the
Yeah.
creative work that actors and others are doing.
Yeah, absolutely. We're in preparing the book and researching the book and writing the book. Were there films that you saw for the first time or performances you saw for the first time that you really loved?
That's a great question. Okay. There were, I would say more, it was more of a case of I saw performances that I loved. I watched so many movies. So many movies and a lot of movies from like the classical era, a lot of B movies.
Yeah.
So, I mean, as you know, there's a whole chapter in there where I talk about John Wayne, which is not so
Yes.
much to expect in a book about method acting, but I wanted to get a sense of like what was he like as an actor, because so much of how he and his kind of studios promoted him was as the antithesis of the method actor. And I was like, well, what does that even mean, right? What does that mean in like the 1940s before method actor, quote unquote method actor, is even something that's talked about? And so I watched a lot of B. I mean, almost every. I think I watched all but maybe like two or three of his B movies, and there were a lot of B movies. In terms of like my favorite performances, this is not one of my favorite films, but Four Daughters, which was John
Oh
Garfield's,
yeah.
and there is this thing when we can kind of look back on like a star's career and we can see like that moment. It's the stagecoach moment where like the camera comes in and it's just like frames the person's face and you're like, that person's a star, right?
Right.
And Garfield gets that, and in Four Daughters, like they open the door and he like is just sitting, he's just standing there, and he just gets to like 7 minutes to just shine, and he is so different from every other actor in that film. And there are some great actors in that film. Claude Rains is in that movie, right? Claude Rains is wonderful.
Amazing. Yeah.
But Garfield is just doing something different, and he makes it look effortless, and he seems like a man out of time. I'm not, the movie itself is pretty pedestrian, but that performance, I'm just like, I come back to that, and I will frequently rewatch his introduction because I'm like, he looks like a character from like a 1950s, method actor movie, and this is like in 1939, right? He just makes it look so effortless, and I know that it's not, but he's so good at it. I actually hadn't watched before I worked on this project. I hadn't watched Brando's first film. I hadn't watched The Men.
Oh, The Men. Oh wow.
That was fascinating to watch, especially after I watched it. I chose to watch it after having done all the research around its publicity, because there's a lot of publicity around it. Because he was coming off of the Streetcar Broadway stint, and so there was like, oh, this guy's gonna be the next big star. Here's his first movie, and so I found that really intriguing, for the way that it really focused on his body. It's focused so much on his body,
Right.
and again, like the story itself, I didn't find particular. It didn't really grab me, but like the performance really, really grabbed me. Another film much later that I thought I hadn't seen before working on this book was Robert Altman's Come Back to the Five and Dime, Jimmy Dean.
Oh yeah. I just, because when you wrote about it in your book, I hadn't seen it before, and I just watched it and I loved it. And my God, everybody in that is it's everyone's amazing. Everyone is amazing in that.
And so I knew a little bit about Sandy Dennis. I knew a little bit about kind of her, brilliant performer.
She was great.
Someone who I think had a lot of struggles and was not treated particularly well by the industry. But I was really fascinated by how that film was telling a story that was kind of reckoning with stuff that I was writing about earlier in the book, about like James Dean fandom and what does it mean to like remember a person and a performer and what people represent. And here we have this happening at this moment when like the kind of broader regard for method acting is kind of moving more and more into this kind of like very strict binary of like, we either really love it or we think that these people are terrible, right? And to think about it as a kind of counter to something like Tootsie, which really plays up the method acting stuff, again, without mentioning method acting, but really plays it up and kind of comes down on the side of like, yeah, these people are brilliant, right? Like they're messed up and weird, but it's all because they're brilliant. And Come Back to the Five and Dime, Jimmy Dean is much more, it's much messier and it's much more complicated, and it's not, Sandy Dennis's character Mona, she's not a likable character. It's not, she's not winning you over in the end. Like it's a really complicated portrayal. And so thinking of, like, that really got me thinking about like, here's an entirely different way of seeing like method acting working. And an entirely different kind of movie. And, I think if that movie were to be made now, I think it would probably get a bit more attention than it got at the time.
Probably, yeah.
Yeah. But those are the films and the performances that come to mind the most. I will say that two documentaries I watched related to this. One of which I wrote a lot about, which was the Robert Altman co-directed James Dean documentary shortly after he died, which is fascinating. As someone who was born in Indiana, I was born about, I think it's about 30 miles from where James Dean was born.
Oh wow.
And so like I even though we're talking about 50 years apart in terms of when we were born, there are a lot of kind of very Indiana things about that, and I was fascinated about the way that it kind of tried to tie his Midwesternness, basically his whiteness, to like who he was, and
Right.
and to his identity as an actor. But then, as I mentioned earlier in our conversation, the documentary about the making of Tootsie, like that's just such an unvarnished portrayal of someone, at the I'd say at the height of his kind of renown. In the case of Dustin Hoffman, someone at the top of his game in terms of Sidney Pollack, and you have like this really interesting juxtaposition of performers. You have, you see Hoffman at work, but you also see someone like the magnificent and eternally underrated Terry Garr.
Oh yeah, it's brilliant in it.
And again, like we talked about comedy, right? Like comedic acting. That's what she's doing in that role and in that film is just brilliant. Like
Yeah,
it's brilliant.
it really is.
And it's sometimes very physical, and sometimes it's very cerebral, and she just kind of effortlessly moves between those, right? And so just getting a glimpse of that, was to me so fascinating. And so I worked hard to find a way to kind of work that into the chapter, because I don't know how much that documentary circulated. I don't know how many people saw it, but it's such a fascinating glimpse at actors in their own processes, and actors kind of in collaboration with other cast and crew, in making a movie. And it's such a contrast between like Jessica Lange and Terry Garr on the one hand, and then like Dustin Hoffman on the other, right?
Yeah.
And it's really something. It's really telling.
Did you see the documentary on the making of a few years later, Death of a Salesman, the TV movie Dustin did?
Oh, I didn't.
Oh wow! Oh, you got to see that. Yeah,
Okay.
It's brilliant. Yeah, it's really really good because he did. I'm sure you know this. He did it on Broadway, and then they did a TV film. Him and John Malkovich, and German director directed it. Schlond, is it? Yeah, he's really Schlondorf. I believe is his. I'll have to put a text up. I'm sure I'm getting his last name not pronounced right. It's really good. It's interesting because he doesn't argue with the director as much, but you certainly see the way in which he prepares before a take, and then you see when takes are not going well and how frustrated he gets. It's great for actors to see, because it's so often actors are so hard on ourselves. Like if one take's not good, we think we're like the worst actors ever. Sure. But you see how he doesn't give up. He's like, let's keep going now, and then if it's not any better, we'll let's continue tomorrow. Because I think part of it was just he was so tired. Everyone was so tired, doing working long days, and he's doing this intense scene with John Malkovich, and it made me laugh because he even said, "Well, John's doing great, but I'm not," But it's really good. Yeah, if you get a chance. If you get the DVD or I'm not sure if it's on Blu-ray, but it's a special feature on there.
Okay, I'm totally gonna check this out. I mean, you got me thinking about something, which is, I think it's the kind of popular reception of method acting now actually does a great disservice to the real work of performance. Like there's we as the moviegoer, we see the result, right? And after it's been kind of like the edges have often been kind of polished off, and it's it's tightly like edited within the overall film, but like the everyday work of being vulnerable, of trying to like of working with a group of other people,
Yes.
actors, writers, and the sheer work of doing that for hours and hours and hours, and just putting yourself out there, and the kind of there's all the physical work of that, but there's also the psychological work of that, and that's not maybe we, and I say we as in terms of the popular we, maybe we misunderstand that because we can't quantify it,
We don't see
right?
it. Yeah.
Or yeah, maybe it's also a misunderstanding on on the general public's part that like we conflate kind of what we perceive to be like the select few stars who make tens of millions of dollars. We misunderstand that as being representative of like the entire body of like actors, right? And like, well, everyone who's acting must be doing great. I got a sense of this again in some of the responses I was seeing to the horrible wildfires in LA, right? And it's like, people getting online getting really upset and really angry that like an actor from like a 1990s TV show is weeping that they've lost their house and everything, and they're like, well, why don't you have all this money? It's like, no, that's actually not how it works.
Right. Right. Right.
Unless you are part of a very 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 small number of
Yeah.
actors, you do not like this is a job for you. This is work.
Right.
You sometimes you don't work for long periods of time.
Yeah.
Don't make money. Like it's not, and so that there's something about our kind of lack of access to, or lack of empathy for, or lack of understanding of the work of acting that um I find it it saddens me because like
Yeah.
in doing all this research, it's like, man, there's so many people working, so like acting is not the kind of it's a creative enterprise, and like all creative enterprises, there's a lot of work and a lot of toil that go into that
Yeah.
that aren't evident to people in the end result, right?
Yeah.
uh, and so I don't know where I'm going with this, but it's something that I've been thinking a lot about lately.
Yeah.
um
There's your
and
next book, that's I guess
well
that would be
I
a good book.
thinking about, I mean, I'm kind of thinking about this in terms of like the way that we're kind of coming to understand AI. And one of the reasons why
Mm,
AI is such a potentially dangerous thing is that, I think it represents a kind of larger conversation that we're not having about, well, how do we understand creativity, and how do we understand the work of making things like um, there have been some really interesting pieces written, relatively recently about what is it, can AI make creative stuff? And I think about, again, all the work that goes into acting, and I'm like, that is such a distinctly human thing. That work of like thinking about how does a human being respond to this situation? How does, how would I, if I were this character, how would I carry myself in the world, and how would I would like relate to my family and my job and the situation, all that stuff. That is such a distinctly human thing, and so I
mm.
think I've been thinking about that work a lot. I think primarily in relation to AI, but I noticed a kind of misunderstanding of the work of acting a lot in response to the fires of all things.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
because I know you end the book with the future of AI, and you talked about in the documentary Listen to Me, Marlon, how it starts with him, and he's doing that scan, he's getting a
Ah,
scan done, and he's
yeah.
saying, oh, this is the future, they're gonna
Yep.
have AI actors, and you got to get in on it and stuff. And I remember I saw that right when it came out, and 10 years ago, before we were really concerned about this. And I just laughed, thinking, oh, it's funny that he did. Now I'm like, oh, wait, that was a pretty, in
Yeah.
a way, like that he's championing that was like,
Yep.
not not really a good
Yeah.
thing. I mean, I know you mentioned this. I mean, likely he was thinking he could cash in on it with
Right.
with his image, but
Right.
I would imagine that people creating this, they would have to. I don't know how they would do it, because, like you said, I mean, when actors step in front of a camera or on a stage, they don't necessarily know what's going to happen. If they're acting well, they're leading with their instincts and they're listening and responding. So, how can you if you're telling a computer what to do? How could you? I just don't see how it would work unless these people first were trained as actors. But even then, how could you? Just because they want to make sort of put really good realistic acting in a computer. Who knows if they may be able to intellectually understand it, but to be able to experience it in the body it takes time. So how these things are going to work, or how these people doing it are even going to learn it well.
Whose ideas of performance? Whose ideas of performance get programmed into this? Like, let's say the technology even exists, which I'm not convinced it does. But like, if it does, who decides what method acting is? Who decides? Like, are they? Like one of the examples I cite, it's two engineers who claim that they're going to teach this AI actor to act, and it's like there's no sign that these people have method training, but they say we're going to teach them method acting. And I find that very curious, because so much of what acting is, at least as I perceive it, acting and the overall creative process involved is not simply following a rubric. You're not following the expectations. You're often subverting expectations. So how do you teach something to go against its own instincts? Right. Like I don't know. But it's, for me, these conversations about the future are so wedded to the past and how we have come to understand and largely misunderstand screen acting. And what concerns me is that if those misunderstandings then become the basis for informing future potential, AI actors, then we are well and truly threatening the kind of existence of these really formative ideas of performance, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And then suddenly it's it's our idea of acting that's replacing the acting itself.
Right.
That is not just fascinating to me, but that's troubling.
Yeah, me as well. So we'll see. We'll see what the future holds. Last question. I love the Brando cover. It's beautiful cover. Why the choice of Brando from on the set of The Men for the cover of your book?
That's an excellent question. I was intrigued by the fact that he is supposed to be playing a paraplegic in this film, and so much of the rhetoric around Brando was about how he's spending time at this veterans rehabilitation hospital, and he's only going to use his arms. He's going to live like someone with paraplegia, and that's part of his immersive preparation, right? And so you can kind of see the elements of methodness there. And yet you have this moment where the kind of constructedness of all that is on display, where he's standing up, leaning against the wheelchair, while the actual paraplegic veterans are behind him playing cards at this place. And so I feel like that image is doing a couple of things. It's showing that. It's also showing Brando just being extremely cool, right? He's got the script there. That's he's studying the script, but he's also been smoking a cigarette. And so it's you kind of get the elements of the cool rebel star image, which is absolutely part of our understanding of him as a performer. You also have the kind of juxtaposition of him, the able-bodied actor, kind of stepping away from this plain disabled, which is an unfortunate part of the way that dramatic realist acting has been received, is that it tends to overvalue able-bodied actors playing disabled. You think about, My Left Foot is more one of the more kind of talked about examples of this. But I felt like that image captured some of some of what draws us popularly to a method actor and to someone like Brando. I feel like it expresses some of the contradictions there. And of course, as I quickly reveal in the book's introduction, Brando is not a method actor, right? Like here we are, this guy who's routinely held up as the method actor, and someone who is not a method actor, but like his reception as a method actor is very telling about this broader way in which we understand method acting or misunderstand, right? That he is part of this tradition, but that method acting means something very specific, and that's what he's pushing back against, right? And so, you know, it's the iconicity of the performer and the performance that I seek to quickly kind of question. You know, I think I feel fairly confident that Brando would have agreed with that.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I imagine so. I mean, I shouldn't say for sure, as if he was my, you know, best friend. From everything I've read about him, I'm sure there. You know, I can only speculate that he would agree there. I don't even know if I should ask authors this, because I know books are fairly easy to find nowadays. But if people want to get the book, where's the best place for them to go?
I would recommend folks go to the University of Texas Press. Go through them. They're great. They've been amazing to work with. They routinely run sales on their catalog, and so that's what I publish through. So I would direct people through there. You can also get it through bookshop.org. That's a good place to go as well, if you want to support more local outlets, and not fuel the giant the giant unnamed and a certain unnamed internet behemoth.
Yeah, we know who you mean. Well, I'll leave the links in the description box to point people to those links if they want to buy it. And if people want to follow you and what you're up to, are you on social media? Where is the best place for them to go?
Yeah, folks can follow me on Bluesky. That's where I am primarily these days. So I'll be happy to share my handle there with you. I can't remember off the top of my head, but that's where I am more or less these days.
Okay, great. Yeah. Well, I'll send it to me, or I'm sure I could just easily find it then, because I'm on there as well, and I'll put it in the description box below. Well, Justin, thanks again. This was such a great conversation, and I'm so glad that I read your book and that you took the time to come on. And for anyone interested, not just in method acting or acting, but I think in movies and classic Hollywood up until the present, I think you'll get a lot out of this. So, Justin, thank you again. Come again sometime down the road.
Absolutely will. Thank you for having me, Robert. This was wonderful.
And thank you all so much for watching. I want to thank all of my members on Patreon. If you're interested in becoming a member of my Patreon, head over to the link, patreon.com/Robert Bellissimo at the movies for full details. You can also leave a donation, or what I call a tip, by clicking the thanks link, which you will find directly below the video frame. Just click on that and you can leave a donation if you choose to. Of course, I would greatly appreciate that. And lastly, if this is your first time here, please consider subscribing. It is absolutely free to do so. By pressing the Robert Bellissimo at the movie logo, you will see it floating above my head in the top left corner to your top left. In just a second, just click on that. And then click the bell in order to get a notification every time I release one of my new videos. I would also really appreciate if you leave a comment, share the video, like the video. All of these things create traction onto my YouTube channel and really help share the video far and wide, and the channel in general. So thank you so much for doing that, and I will see you all in the next one.